It was a crisp fall morning when the president made an uncharacteristic decision. He wanted to experience his airline from the passenger's perspective. The weight of the responsibilities he bore each day was immense, that something had been gnawing at him for weeks. He had heard whispers from various sources, staff members, industry insiders, even passengers about the current state of his airline. Some praised the customer service and the quality of the new amenities. Others had expressed frustrations with delays, overcrowded flights, and a lack of personal attention from the crew. As a leader, he knew it was essential to be in touch with reality, to hear the honest feedback that people didn't always share through formal channels. Too many decisions were made based on reports, statistics, and spreadsheets. He needed to experience it for himself. He had to understand how the airline was performing on the ground, what passengers truly thought, how the crew felt, and whether the airline he owned was really living up to the high standards it professed. And so, in a rare moment of discretion, the president decided to book a flight on his own airline undercover, without revealing his identity. It was a gamble, but one he felt was necessary. He didn't want special treatment or any VIP perks. He wanted to see what the airline was like from the perspective of an everyday passenger. Someone who simply boarded, sat down, and hoped for the best. It wasn't going to be easy. He would have to step away from the spotlight and assume the role of a regular traveler, booking his flight under a fake name, wearing ordinary clothes to blend in. But the chance to get raw, unfiltered feedback from those on the front lines, his crew, his passengers, was worth the effort. Booking the flight. Under the alias of John Matthews, the president booked 2 first-class tickets for himself, one for a colleague, and a few extra seats for security in the rows behind. It wasn't unusual for a high-profile figure to travel anonymously from time to time, so the booking process went smoothly. He selected a morning flight from Washington, D.C. to New York City, a routine business route that wouldn't attract attention. He double-checked the flight details to ensure no one in his circle would recognize his name on the manifest. The plan was simple. Keep a low profile. He would board the plane just like any other passenger, sit back and observe. The first class cabin was a relatively quiet section of the plane, and he would have a few hours to watch the service unfold. The airline's performance during this flight would be his personal benchmark. How did the crew handle the rush of passengers? Did the flight attendants maintain a level of professionalism, or was there tension in the air? He needed to know if the airline's brand was being upheld, both in terms of service and efficiency. With everything set in place, the president had his security detail coordinate the logistics without drawing attention to the operation. The idea was to be as low-key as possible. They would not be greeted with fanfare. The goal was to fly under the radar, to be treated exactly as any ordinary passenger would. The true test would be how he was treated without the knowledge of who he really was. The secret boarding. The day of the flight arrived, and the president, dressed in a simple dark blue suit with no distinguishing marks of importance, entered the airport like any other businessman. His security team was discreet, keeping a low profile as well. They didn't stand out or surround him with an air of protection that might draw attention. The president carried only a small carry-on bag, just another corporate traveler rushing to his gate. When he approached the check-in counter, he used his alias, John Matthews, with no fanfare. The staff at the counter was busy with their own tasks, and the president's name didn't raise any suspicions. He handed over his ID and boarding pass as usual, and there was no indication that anyone recognized him. The quiet satisfaction of remaining anonymous for the time being was palpable. In the security line. He kept his head down, like any other traveler. No one gave him a second glance. The flight was standard, no special treatment. no special accommodations. As the plane's boarding began, he quietly joined the queue for first passengers. Just another name on the list. Just another person headed to the luxurious front of the plane. He didn't look out of place. His suit, clean and neat, was nothing extravagant, and the passengers around him were busy with their own thoughts, oblivious to the person who was quietly slipping into one of the plush seats. Once seated in his first-class section, the president settled into his chair, observing his surroundings with a keen eye. The cabin was typical of the airline's upscale offerings: plush seats with ample legroom, leather-clad armrests, overhead bins with ample space, and the comforting hum of the engines starting to roar as the plane prepared to take off. Despite his calm demeanor, he couldn't help but feel a rising sense of anticipation. What would he hear? What would he learn from this? As the flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out drinks and snacks to passengers, the president leaned back and waited. He didn't want to engage immediately, he was there to listen. He watched the crew interact with the passengers, making notes in his head about their body language, their tone of voice, their level of engagement. Were they polite? Were they efficient? Did they seem invested in providing excellent service? Or were they just going through the motions? From where he sat, the interactions appeared smooth, professional, and attentive. But this was just the surface. The true test would come when the cabin had settled, when the routine service had started to slow down, and when the flight attendants thought no one was paying attention. The flight attendants. The first interaction came when Linda, one of the flight attendants, came by to check on the passengers. She asked the president if he needed anything, offering a warm smile. He requested a glass of water and a light snack, nothing too extravagant. Her response was polite, and she moved on quickly to serve the others. But there was something in her movements that piqued the president's interest. She seemed rushed, distracted, almost detached. Linda didn't seem to make eye contact with him for long, and she moved swiftly from one passenger to the next. The president was used to people being busy, especially on a flight, but there was a slight tension in her manner that made him pause. Was she just overworked? Or was there something more beneath the surface? As the flight continued, he could hear Linda talking to her colleague Sarah as they moved toward the back of the plane. They didn't realize he could hear their conversation, and he was intent on gathering as much insight as possible. At first, their conversation seemed innocuous. A few jokes about the flight, small talk about their schedules. But then, the mood shifted. That's when he overheard their complaints. It started subtly: Linda venting about the challenges of the job, the demands placed on the crew, and the lack of support from the airline's management. As she spoke more freely to Sarah, the president could sense the growing frustration in her voice. As the plane ascended into the sky, the president settled deeper into his seat, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. He had come for insight, real, unfiltered insight into the airline's operations. From the outside, everything appeared smooth and efficient. The first-class cabin, with its plush leather seats and attentive service, seemed like the epitome of luxury. He had been in the airline industry long enough to understand the value of appearances. But this time, he wanted to look beyond the polished exterior and into the true dynamics of his operation. He watched the flight attendants as they made their rounds, smiling politely as they delivered drinks and snacks. There was a certain level of professionalism in their interactions, a level of politeness that was expected in first class. Yet something was off. Linda, the flight attendant he had interacted with earlier, seemed to be moving through her duties almost robotically. She wasn't rude, but she didn't seem genuinely engaged either. Her eyes occasionally flicked nervously to the back of the cabin, as if she was waiting for something, or perhaps dreading it. The president couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He continued to observe, hoping to uncover more of what was happening behind the scenes. As the plane leveled off, he watched Linda exchange a few words with another flight attendant, Sarah, who had taken over the next section of the cabin. Sarah appeared younger, but she too seemed distracted, her movements quick and mechanical. When the cabin lights dimmed and passengers began to settle in for the duration of the flight, the president heard a familiar sound, the low murmur of the crew, talking as they passed through the galley. It was only a few seconds before Linda and Sarah started their conversation. The president leaned forward slightly, careful not to make it obvious that he was eavesdropping. He had heard snatches of their conversation before, but now, with the cabin noise dulling, the words came more clearly. The conversation begins. Linda's voice, tinged with frustration, was the first to break the silence. I swear, I'm at the end of my rope, Sarah. This schedule is killing me. I've been working back-to-back flights for over a week now, and no one cares. The management doesn't even see what's going on. They just expect us to smile and serve like it's all just part of the job. Sarah nodded in agreement, pausing briefly as she organized her cart of drinks. I know. It's like we're invisible to them. If we don't smile, if we don't do our job perfectly, we get scolded or written up. But when we actually speak up about needing more time between flights or help with the passengers, they just ignore us. It's as if they don't even see the real problems we're dealing with on the ground. The president's brow furrowed slightly as he absorbed their words. This wasn't just frustration over a few long shifts or hectic schedules. This was systemic frustration, an ongoing issue that was being ignored by higher management. He could hear the rawness in Linda's voice, the exhaustion in Sarah's tone. They weren't just talking about inconvenience. They were talking about a culture of neglect, a culture that had been allowed to persist. Unfiltered criticism of the airline's leadership. Linda's voice grew a little louder, as if Sarah had given her the opening she needed to vent. You know what gets me? The VIP treatment we give to high-profile passengers, like the ones sitting up front. They don't know the reality of what goes on behind the scenes. They get pampered while we're stuck running around, doing the work for everyone else. And they think that's how it's supposed to be. They don't see how bad things really are. If they only knew what it's like to actually work the flight crew's shifts, they'd get an earful. Sarah sighed, looking out the window as she responded. Yeah, don't even get me started on the management. They're so detached from the day-to-day operations. If they could walk one day in our shoes, maybe they'd realize how hard we're working. They'd see how their poor decisions trickle down to us: delays, bad scheduling, equipment shortages. They think we're just a bunch of drones on a plane, but we're the ones who make sure everything runs smoothly. And they don't care about any of it. The president's heart sank. He had heard rumors about discontent among the staff, but this was the truth. This wasn't a vague complaint from a disgruntled employee. These were the voices of the people who worked in the trenches every day, making sure the airline functioned. And what were they getting in return? Overworked shifts, unreasonable expectations, and management that seemed utterly disconnected from their reality. The realization. As the conversation continued, the president felt a rising sense of unease. The flight attendants didn't hold back. They continued to criticize not just the lack of support from management, but also the disjointed and often contradictory expectations placed on them. They complained about constant last-minute changes to schedules, lack of communication from upper management, and the fact that they were expected to juggle multiple duties without proper resources. You know, Linda continued, they keep talking about these upgrades in first class, about making everything look nicer. But who cares if the service isn't there? They want us to make every passenger feel like a VIP, but they're not giving us the tools to do that. And the worst part, they don't even know how it affects us. If they could just take a look at what we're really going through, maybe they'd understand. Sarah nodded in agreement, her voice quieter now. It's frustrating. We've had to pick up the slack for months now. And when we do speak up, we're just told to get over it. It's like we're not even heard. No one cares about our well-being. We just have to keep going, no matter what. The president sat back, absorbing the gravity of what he was hearing. The complaints weren't just about the routine difficulties that any airline crew might face. They were about a deep-rooted issue within the company's leadership. A culture of neglect had grown unchecked, one that dehumanized the very employees who kept the airline afloat. The president's reflection. As the conversation began to wind down, Linda and Sarah moved on to other topics more personal, more trivial, but the president remained deeply affected by what he had overheard. His mind raced, thinking back to the moments when he had observed the crew's behavior. He had watched Linda and Sarah earlier, and now he could understand why they seemed so distant, why their interactions with passengers felt hollow. They weren't just doing a job. They were surviving within a broken system. A system that wasn't listening to them, wasn't supporting them. He had been on the outside looking in for too long, making decisions based on statistics and reports. But this experience, this raw, unfiltered conversation, had revealed something far more profound. It wasn't just about service or amenities. It was about the people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, giving their all for an airline that seemed to have forgotten them. As the plane continued its journey toward New York, the president knew that the moment he had been dreading was coming. He would have to face these truths, face the very employees who were in the trenches, and make some tough decisions. But there was one thing he knew for certain now. Change was necessary, and it had to start at the top. As the plane flew on its journey to New York, the president felt a mixture of emotions that he couldn't easily explain. Anger, frustration, and a deep sense of guilt swirled in his chest. He had spent years managing the country's leadership, with a level of attention to detail, but this was personal. The conversation he had overheard between the flight attendants, Linda and Sarah, was like a slap in the face. A glaring revelation that something within his airline was fundamentally broken. What troubled him the most wasn't just the complaints about long hours or mismanagement. It wasn't even the fact that his crew was struggling under pressure. It was that his leadership had allowed this situation to persist for so long without him even realizing it. He had known, deep down, that there were challenges in his airlines. Operations, every company had them, but he never expected to hear that the very people who were supposed to be providing excellent service felt unsupported, neglected, and unseen. He had created an environment that had led to burnout, frustration, and, most of all, a disconnect between the leadership and the ground-level operations. And now, it was too late to pretend he didn't know. The truth had been laid bare in front of him, not through reports or board meetings, but through the voices of 2 flight attendants, people who were giving everything they had, only to be met with indifference and neglect from the top. The weight of it all felt crushing. The decision to act. As the flight began its descent into New York, the president knew what he had to do. This couldn't just be another instance of hearing a complaint and letting it fall through the cracks. This couldn't be another empty promise of things will get better. The problems Linda and Sarah had voiced were not just about operational efficiency, they were about a deep cultural issue within his airline. His decision was clear. He would take immediate action. He would confront the management, sit down with the crew, and make real changes to improve working conditions and communication. No more pretending that everything was fine. No more neglecting the very people who made the business run. He had to fix this, and he had to do it now. The flight touched down smoothly, and passengers began to gather their belongings. The president, still sitting quietly in his seat, watched as the crew began to prepare for disembarkation. His mind was racing, but there was a clear resolve in his heart. He would make this right. The reveal. As the passengers slowly exited the plane, the president remained seated. He knew it was time to reveal who he was. There had been no fanfare during the flight, no special treatment for him. He had been John Matthews from the moment he stepped on board, and he had wanted to keep it that way. But now, with the mission complete, it was time to take responsibility for what he had heard and learned. He needed to speak directly to the flight attendants and to the staff, without any barriers. He stood up, straightened his suit, and moved toward the galley, where Linda and Sarah were still tidying up. The moment they saw him approaching, they froze. The realization hit them at the same time. The man who had been sitting in first class, quietly observing, was none other than the President of the United States. Their eyes widened, and both women immediately tensed. They had no idea what was about to happen, but the air between them shifted. Linda, Sarah, the president said, his voice calm but firm. I need to speak with both of you. The two flight attendants exchanged nervous glances but nodded in acknowledgement, unsure of how to respond. I've been listening to everything you said during the flight, the president continued, his voice clear. I heard your frustrations, I heard your concerns, and I want to apologize. There was a long pause as Linda and Sarah processed the words. They were stunned. The president, someone they had never imagined would be on the flight, let alone overhear their private conversation, was standing right in front of them. I never realized the depth of the issues you've been dealing with, the president continued. The burnout, the feeling of being unheard, the lack of support. These are not things you should have to carry alone. I want to make sure that changes, starting now. The weight of his words hung in the air. Linda, still in shock, opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It was as if her brain was still processing what had just happened. Mr. Matthews, I'm so sorry, she finally stammered. We didn't mean for it to sound like that. But don't apologize, the president interjected. You didn't say anything wrong. You said exactly what needed to be said. The fact is, I've been too distant, too disconnected from the realities of how this airline is being run. I've focused too much on the big picture, and not enough on the people who actually make it work. That changes today. A promise for change. The president's words were sincere. He could see the mix of confusion and disbelief on Linda and Sarah's faces, but also something else, hope. A small spark of hope that things might actually change. I'm going to be reaching out to management, the president continued. We will address the issues you've raised, and we'll do it in a way that prioritizes the well-being of the crew and the quality of service. I want to make sure the leadership team hears your concerns, loud and clear. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, and we've clearly missed the mark. Linda, still trying to absorb everything, managed a small nod. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. I can't tell you how much it means to us to know that you're actually listening. The president smiled softly. It's the least I can do. I should have been paying attention sooner. But I promise you, we'll get this right. Confronting management. The president wasted no time in taking action. The very next day, he arranged a meeting with the senior leadership team of his airline. The conversation was difficult, and the room was tense as he confronted the management about the systemic issues that had been brought to light during his flight. The feedback I received was eye-opening, the president said in the meeting. We have employees who are working harder than anyone realizes, and they are exhausted, unsupported, and feeling invisible. It's not just about schedules or policies, it's about creating a culture that values people. We need to do better. There were no excuses, no deflections. The management team sat in silence, realizing the full extent of their failure. The president's directness was unsettling, but it was necessary. They knew they couldn't keep hiding behind the veneer of corporate reports and impersonal metrics anymore. The problems ran deeper than that. The first steps toward change. In the weeks that followed, significant changes began to take shape within the airline. New policies were introduced to address crew burnout. Better communication systems were established to ensure that staff could share their concerns, and regular town hall meetings were scheduled to allow employees at all levels to speak openly about the challenges they were facing. The president made sure to follow up regularly, keeping a close eye on the implementation of these changes. He even made surprise visits to different branches of the airline, traveling without notice, to ensure that the improvements were being felt on the ground. It was a start, but a necessary one. The impact months later, as the president boarded another flight, this time for a public appearance in a different city, he noticed the difference immediately. The flight attendants were more engaged, more upbeat, and the entire cabin had a different energy. The passengers felt it too. There was a palpable sense of care and attention in the air. When he overheard a conversation between two flight attendants about how things had changed, he smiled quietly to himself. He hadn't solved everything, but he had started the process. And that was enough. It was a reminder that leadership wasn't about just making big decisions from behind a desk. It was about being present, listening to those on the front lines, and understanding the real impact of your actions. The president knew the road ahead would be long, but he had taken the first step, and in doing so, he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes, the most powerful change begins with simply listening.